So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm, as you might notice, I'm not in my usual studio. I'm not at home. I got up at 5 this morning to fly down to Mobile, Alabama. We're in the La Quinta Inn here, Airport La Quinta at Mobile. We'll be working from Mobile the rest of the week, getting some things set up. Today, we're going to talk about cardiorespiratory fitness. It's essential to reduce risk of coronary heart disease. Now, that may raise the question, well, if cardiovascular fitness does decrease heart disease risk, then why doesn't a stress test, can't it predict heart attack? We'll talk about that, but we'll talk about that much later. First of all, let's go through some of our previous topics and then some of the other content that we make available. Statins, are they worth using for COVID? No, that's not the point, and we talk about it in that video. Is stevia bad for gut health? We've had a lot of interest, a lot of discussion about that. Osteoporosis and bisphosphonates. We've got about 1,000 other videos out there, so if you're a boomer, if you're concerned about cardiovascular disability and risk, this is a great place to find out some stuff. In fact, we've got these courses because it's been demonstrated very clearly in the science. And that's one of the things we do in this channel. We focus on the evidence, the science, what's out there. That gets a little confusing sometimes for some folks. So our goal is to tease that science out, show the evidence, show what actually works, what causes problems, and how to fix that. There's a lot of evidence that shows that your typical doctor does not understand prediabetes, how to diagnose it, let alone how to manage it. So we've developed a series of webinars and courses, which in just an hour or two, you can start learning a lot more about the root cause of heart attack and stroke than even your doctor probably knows. So think about looking at those if you have interest. We have it in a webinar format. We have it in a course format. Both of them are very accessible. Now, guess what? We finally got this thing published and it's ready. You can find it on Amazon. We're going to set up a landing page. Sam already set up the landing page. We're getting that geared up. You'll see it on our website. You'll see it on a couple of other places as we start getting that information out there. Now, my two of my favorite authors are Hemingway and Chekhov. Chekhov was actually a public health doc in Russia. When I go back and read this thing, it's really clear to me I'm not a Hemingway or a Chekhov. In fact, I don't recommend that you try to sit down and read the whole book. It's a little bit too dense, a little bit too heavy for that. Now, you can read the first couple of chapters, but the book was written to help people understand what their doctor's talking about. So, for example, if your doctor says, go ahead and read the first 2 chapters, but if your doctor says, well, look, your Framingham, this shows that you've got X amount of risk. Well, then you can go in and look up Framingham and see the good and the bad on Framingham. For example, Framingham overestimates risk. And the end result is a lot of people, especially women, get put on statins because of problems with Framingham. The title of the book is Prevention Myths, and it focuses on why stress tests can't predict a heart attack. Now, we're going to talk about that some again at the end of this the program today. But again, there's a specific chapter in this book on stress tests, how to define them, what to look for with them, and why they don't actually predict a heart attack. It also talks about other tests that do. If your doctor's wanting to take you to the cath lab, it tells you all about what goes on in the cath lab. It shows you the evidence behind each of the things that the doctor does if he wants to get an angiogram. Like I said, it also talks about 3 tests that really do help. I would avoid a stress test and a cath lab and a stent most of the time. If you're having a heart attack and a stent works, that's when a stent's helpful. But 90% of stents are done to prevent a heart attack, and the evidence really shows that they don't do that. We go into that evidence in the book. The 3 tests that I would use, that I do use regularly, are the IMT, intima media thickness test, to show whether you have plaque or not, and to show whether that plaque is soft or inflamed, hot. The calcium score, it's a great test. It just doesn't show you whether or not you've got hot plaque. And it's got a little bit of radiation, but this goes into the detail. Don't worry about radiation if you're worried about assessing your, or at least radiation from a calcium score. If you're assessing heart attack risk. There's a newcomer on the block. It's a CT angiogram. We're starting to use more and more of that as well. So this book really gives you the evidence and the details behind those. And sometimes another thing I realize is I go back and reread it. I write like I speak. Sometimes I go down these bunny holes and you're finding yourself going, where is he going with this? You know what? Like Popeye used to say, I am what I am. Okay, so today we're going to talk about cardiorespiratory fitness. It is essential to reduce risk of coronary heart disease. So we're going to talk about a couple of studies. They were from 2017. They highlight the importance of cardiorespiratory fitness. Both in this first study, they look at cardiorespiratory fitness and the triglyceride over HDL ratio as predictors of death from coronary heart disease. You can't have seen many videos on this channel without having seen the triglyceride over HDL. So these articles provide substantive evidence, which is what we do, on the importance of achieving moderate to high levels of cardiorespiratory fitness. When you see CRF on this set of slides, it's referring to cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, the second study, the first study looked at men, and the second study looked at kids. So let's talk about the first study first. It was in Mayo Clinic proceedings. Moderate to high levels of cardiorespiratory fitness attenuate the effects. Sorry about those words. I'm just reading the title of the article. Attenuate the effects of triglyceride to HDL lipoprotein cholesterol ratio on the coronary heart disease mortality in men. Again, way too technical. Don't let that confuse you, and don't even worry about trying to put all that together. We'll show you a graph in just a second. It'll put everything together. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this study is it comes from the Cooper Institute in Dallas. Those of you who it may ring a bell. Ken Cooper wrote the book Aerobics, the original aerobics when the jogging trend started. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. But on this study, 40,269 men received a comprehensive physical exam between 78 and 2010. The exam included a treadmill exercise test and measurement of the triglyceride over HDL ratio. Participants were categorized into low, moderate, and high fitness groups, and then they started stratifying based on those. Regardless of whether the blood triglyceride over HDL ratio was low or high, having moderate to high level of fitness provided some protection from coronary heart disease when compared to having low levels of fitness. So if you look at this graph, I promised we would show a graph which explains the whole thing. Yellow is high cardiorespiratory fitness, again, as measured by the ability to get up there on a stress test. Blue is medium, and red is low fitness. So the higher the bar. Over here on the left-hand side, the vertical is the risk of coronary heart disease mortality, dying from a heart event. So as you see, whether your triglyceride over HDL ratio is low, 1.5 or less, they call that very low, but that's not very low. Most of my patients are able sooner or later to get to 1 or less. That's the target, that's the goal. And these higher numbers, as you can see, are significant risk numbers. Now, once you start stratifying by triglyceride over HDL, you realize no matter what level of triglyceride over HDL you have, you're far better off if you're in good shape. Now, you may remember the video from Chuck Smith where he lost 50 pounds and then he had a heart attack. That was when he discovered our channel and started looking at that video on triglyceride over HDL ratio. He had been on now this doesn't happen to everybody. The goal is not to scare people off of plant-based diets. The goal is to help underline that there's more to cardiovascular risk sometimes than may seem. Chuck had lost a ton of weight. He thought he was in great shape. He had a heart attack, lost 50 pounds. Then he looked and he found that triglyceride over HDL ratio was 7 when he was in the hospital for the heart attack. So as these go up, the highest here is 3.9. You can imagine what a triglyceride over HDL of 7 would be in terms of risk. That's a side issue. Pardon me, went down another bunny hole. The real point here is no matter what your triglyceride over HDL ratio is, being in good cardiovascular conditioning helps. Now, let's go talk about, that was the study on men from the Cooper Institute. Let's talk about the study on kids for a second. This one is titled Cardiorespiratory Fitness Cutoff Points for Early Detection of Present and Future Cardiovascular Risk in Children. It had a 2-year follow-up. In a 2013 study, researchers from Spain tested 213 primary school children, 6 to 10 years old, and followed them for a 2-year period. The aims of the research were to study the association between cardiovascular fitness, or they're calling it CFR, and cardiovascular disease risk in children, and to determine a possible cutoff point related to cardiovascular disease after 2 years for 8 to 12-year-old children. Cardiorespiratory fitness was expressed as oxygen consumption value calculated from a shuttle run test. They looked at other data as well: skin fold thickness, blood pressure, triglyceride levels, HDL levels. And they're looking at triglyceride over HDL. They just didn't put them together. Glucose and insulin levels. So cardiorespiratory fitness levels of at least 39, and we don't need to go deep into that, but at least 38 millimeters per kilogram for girls, 39 for boys. They were associated with a more favorable cardiovascular risk profile, 6 to 10 years, and the 2-year follow-up. Now, what does this tell us? Basically, a couple of things. Number one, cardiovascular risk exists in kids. Now, these were not deaths. These kids weren't dying from it. But what it's showing is, yes, as we know, the obesity epidemic is hitting our younger generation. It's impacting cardiorespiratory fitness. And if a child has a problem with it today, they're much more likely to have a problem with it 2 years later. So that's the issue on kids. Now let's talk for a minute about a couple of issues with the study with men. Number one, we talked about Ken Cooper. It's very interesting. I had done this analysis on this study before I recognized and realized that was Ken Cooper's Aerobics Institute. As I mentioned earlier, it gave me some perspective on the filters that we look at things from. So, as I said, Ken Cooper wrote that original book titled Aerobics. He was all about jogging, and so here's jogging, and it's different from what we're looking at today. I'm coming from a very different filter based on information and evidence research, which has happened since the aerobics craze. Aerobics is just, it's going a little bit faster than walking. Walking is very healthy for our health. And we do need a base of walking. But back in Ken Cooper's day, the perception was, well, you just need to jog. Go out there, go a little bit faster than walking. You should be able to talk while you're jogging. That's the kind of level they're talking about. There was no focus on high intensity intervals. There was no focus on really pushing your cardiovascular limits. There was no focus on resistance training. And you know what? That improved the health of a lot of people. But since that time, since the 70s, 80s, 90s, that aerobics jogging craze, information has come out which indicates, you know what? It's a lot better in terms of insulin resistance, prediabetes, cardiovascular risk, if you can do a couple of other things. In fact, I've got a video where we looked at a study done at Mayo Clinic where they actually took muscle samples of 20 to 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and 70 and 80-year-olds. And the thing that really impacted the mitochondrial muscle mass was not jogging. It was, most of all, high-intensity intervals. And when you look at multiple sports, cycling, endurance sports, performance sports, you don't train for improved performance by just simply long, slow distance. That used to be the mantra back in the aerobics era. LSD, long, slow distance. Nobody's throwing that out. Nobody's throwing that under the bus, but we're realizing now you need to push your metabolism. You need to push it harder. In that Mayo Clinic study, for example, by far, the biggest impact was in the 80-year-olds who were doing high-intensity intervals. A second place was was resistance training, and aerobics was a distant third place in terms of developing mitochondrial muscle mass, which I think most of us would agree is a very desirable thing. So again, aerobics, jogging, that was a good thing that happened for the public's health. But we've got better stuff. We've got better evidence. We're not throwing, I don't think anybody recommends throwing away walking or other types of low-level aerobics, but we need to add the interval training. We need to add that resistance training. That gets to the number one cause, again, insulin resistance. Why does all this work? And why does all of the science for decades has shown if you get 3 good workouts per week, you really have a positive impact on your cardiovascular risk? Well, there's also another correlation to this 3 good workouts per week. One of the things that happens with muscles, and people find that when they use a Freestyle Libre, if you have a blood sugar problem and you go on a carb vacation, you take some carbs, you have a pizza, for example. If you go out and just walk, a simple walk, you'll take the spike, the top right off of that spike. Now that happens because muscle activity bypasses those resistant insulin receptors. So if you can bypass those insulin receptors, then again, you're having a major impact on the number one cause of heart attack, stroke, and plaque, insulin resistance. So the focus is to get that blood sugar out of the blood and into the muscle. What we have found, and it correlates back to that 3 times per week, if it's a large muscle group, if it's intense exercise, this insulin-like effect can last for up to 48 hours. So 48 hours, 3 times a week, get that heavy workout in. Now, last point we're going to make about this is, if this is so helpful, why is stress test not a great way to predict heart attack and stroke? Well, stress test does help. I mean, you can see here that it's being in good condition is a risk factor, so to speak, for being healthy. If you're in better condition, you are more likely to be healthy. But it's a long way, big difference to say cardiovascular conditioning is it decreases your risk, than to say that something like a stress test, which gauges your cardiovascular conditioning, is going to predict heart attack or stroke. You know, you just have to look at cases like Tim Russert's and thousands of others where they did great. Russert was in very good cardiovascular condition, but he still had other stuff going on. So even though he was able to do well on his stress test, it did not predict the heart attack that killed him just a few weeks later. Now, why is that the case? People assume, this all gets back to that plumbing theory, the plumbing assumption for heart attack and stroke. Cardiologists do that. They assume that if you have a tight obstruction in an artery of the heart, you're going to have a heart attack. That's not the way this works. If it did, we would be able to predict heart attacks, and we would be able to prevent them with things like stents and bypass grafts. If you've watched this channel anytime at all, you know that's the problem. It's not the plumbing theory. What we're looking for is soft plaque. In fact, 2/3, way over half, 2/3 of the people that have a heart attack have less than 50% obstruction of the flow in their heart. Now, what's that got to do with anything? It gets us back to the thing about stress test. You're not going to see anything on a stress test indicating risk for heart attack unless your arteries in your heart are blocked 50% or more. That's why a stress test can't predict a heart attack. So thank you so much for your interest today. We're going to go into, Gilbert, if you'll give us the water ball, we'll go into question and answer. So, good morning, good afternoon, James. So on the Cooper study, the lowest ratio is 1.5. Exactly. That's the lowest ratio that you saw there. And people think, you know, it's like when you get your results back on your lab test and they show a normal, they'll classify an insulin level up to a fasting insulin level up to 20 as quote normal. Normal for who? That's a fasting or basal insulin level is not of 20 is not good. That's clearly prediabetes. You see this all over. You see that especially with the triglyceride over HDL ratio. if you look at the average deterioration of our health in this country, that's why you tend to see such lax numbers there. So thank you for pointing that out, James. Haywood Hall, look at that. Haywood, glad to see you on. Appreciate you joining us today. Haywood is working with us in a couple of places. Haywood is the owner of the PACE Health Education Group. They're doing some work for the WHO right now. They're doing work for us. Actually, the video decks that we're using are now being done by Haywood's group at PACE. And Haywood's going to be doing some work with us for the Alabama project. Tired looking for name. $10. That's a super chat. Thank you so much. Garrett, if you could show folks how to do a super chat. This makes a difference, folks. We've got a couple of different teams working with us that are offshore. One in Guanajuato, Mexico, with Haywood that I just mentioned. Another group in the Philippines, and where Gilbert and Sam and Aspen are. And $10 makes a big difference. It helps us get that information, life-saving information, out to the public. So if you want to have an impact like Tired Looking for Name, then just hit the super chat button. It'll make a difference. Old Roscoe, my neighbors already think I'm crazy for walking a mile every day. Gosh, that's pretty bad. Feel sorry for your neighbors. Don't stop walking. Fort Worth West Side, is there an advantage in going to a board certified physician versus non-board certified, and what's the difference? It's the medical establishment's way of assuring quality. So someone who, and there is some advantage depending on the specialty you're looking at. So for example, in order to get board certified, you have to have taken testing in the specific information in that board. Most boards don't even allow you to take the board certification test unless you have a certain number of years, usually 3, of training in that specialty. Now, one of the problems is that there are so few people that are board certified in prevention. And most of the people that are board certified in prevention really look at the public health activities, are more into that. There are very few people out there who are available who know how to do personal cardiovascular prevention. Your typical internist, your family practitioner, your cardiologist, they all say, yes, that's part of what I do. And yes, it is part of what they do. But again, look at the data, look at the information. Make sure that your doc knows how to diagnose prediabetes, how to define it, and how to manage it. And they do something other than just saying, oh, here, let me write you a script for metformin and send you to a nutritionist. Tired looking for name. Question, there's been a lot of talks lately about heart rate variability, HRV. Is HRV in any way indicative of cardiovascular health? Yes, it is. So some of this is a great question. You want a higher level of cardiovascular, of heart rate variability. And it's somewhat related. You may remember when we did the video on the device-assisted slowing your breath and increasing the length of your expiration. With both of those things, that decreases the heart rate. Now, when you breathe in and out, so that's related. It impacts the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight principle. And you want a good, healthy heart is going to respond to normal breathing. In this way, it will increase, the heart rate will increase as you inhale. It'll decrease as you exhale. And it'll decrease as you slow your breathing down. It'll decrease when you have a longer expiratory phase. So those things, you're not going to stop breathing. You're going to keep breathing, and that breathing will cause some of the variability that you'll see here. Now, hearts that are struggling already for stress, for overweight, for problems with cardiovascular issues, those things will decrease the variability of the heart's ability to respond to breath and other things. So it's a great question. Thank you so much. Tired looking for name. Fort Worth, the West Side. Everybody be sure to get on the early bird notice for the new book. Yes, we'll be sending out some get on our email address list. By the way, I have to brag for a second. I don't know if you can see this. We're already an #1 international bestseller. Now, I have to chuckle because when you look at the category that was in, it was in cardiovascular surgery. So it's kind of ironic that the #1 bestseller in that topic is saying, cardiovascular surgery usually doesn't work. Don't do it. So very interesting point. But yes, thank you for the comment, Fort Worth. And if you'll get on our email list, sign up, we will send you the information to get the book. James Cantor had a new hemoglobin A1C, remains 5.4%. Thank you. And James has shared that he's diabetic. 5.4% is great for someone with those conditions. Alejandro Rios, thank you. Thank you for your comment, Alejandro. Here's Haywood. Great to be here. Thank you, Haywood. Great to have you. Alejandro, hard intervals, exercise 3 times a week. Good for you, Alejandro. Keep that up, and others need to consider that as well. I'm going to before I go to Bambi's comment, I'm just going to make this comment. A lot of our patients are folks that really didn't do anything. 70s, even 80s, weren't doing any kind of exercise. Some of them were basically just doing occasional walks in the mall. Now, you say, well, that kind of person can't do a high intensity interval. Yes, they can. It's not so much a destination as it is a journey. You want to be in a position of regularly, 2 to 3 times per week, having these sessions where you push your cardiovascular metabolism, push your body to stress that, to get that high intensity interval done. Now, if you're somebody that wasn't doing any walking, just walking up a slight incline, just maybe walking up a couple of stairs, a flight or 2, those things start making a difference, and doing them 2 and 3 times a week. So thank you so much. I have to stop for a second. No Trash in Heaven, $25. YouTube takes 30%, but it's worth it to keep you here to educate and encourage as many as possible. God bless you. Thank you so much, No Trash in Heaven. I think we will get to this. You can't see it. I don't think you can see it on the channel, but $25 super chat. Thank you so much. That'll help us defray costs. Back to the comments. Bambi Grage, what's considered a heavy workout 3 times per week? Well, again, actually, Bambi, that's just, I should have gone ahead and shown your comment as well for that last set of comments. It depends on your level. So like I said, there's some people, I do hill intervals running. I'll get up to about a 6-minute mile pace and do like a 5% hill, 10%, depending, slower for higher levels of incline. Try to do that for, part of the question about intervals, a lot of people say, well, I did like a half-hour interval. No, you can't really do a half hour at that level where you're pushing your cardiovascular metabolism. You need to go like 40 seconds. You need to be going You need to not be able to talk during the intense part of your interval. So again, it depends on what level of conditioning you're at. Now, Bambi, if I remember correctly, I think you do a lot of resistance training. A lot of people do intervals with resistance training. A lot of people do intervals with road bikes. A lot of people do resistance training with elliptical machines. I have a Nordic track. I've used that for training for marathons and other things. You can, anywhere where you get to where you can push hard for 40 seconds or so, and then slow down and have a slow part of that interval, a slow phase, a rest phase for a minute to a minute and a half. Professional level cyclists do a typical 40-second intense phase followed by a minute and 20-second slower phase. So there you go. We got another super chat here. Parker Reed, thank you so much. I think Parker's, I think you've done a lot of work with some industry in China. I think you made some comments about that recently. Thank you so much, Parker. Freedom Fox 1, good to know that resistance training is so good for heart health. It is excellent for heart health and for reasons that we discussed. You want to increase and maintain that muscle mass. One of the biggest determinants of cardiovascular risk and cardiovascular inflammation as we get past 65 is that loss of muscle mass. So loss of muscle, being a cute little old lady or a cute little old man is not that cute. It is dangerous. You need to work to maintain that muscle mass. Fort Worth West Side. If your inflammation markers are not high, MPO, plaque 2, etc., after taking a low dose of Crestor, can you discontinue the Crestor as long as you stay in lifestyle trends and routinely check your risks? Now, if you've got, first of all, I don't recommend statins unless you have plaque. Now, a whole lot of us, especially by the time we hit, the boomers, 60 and above, especially 65 and above, most of us have some level of plaque. You didn't feel it when that plaque happened. You could say, well, a lot of people have gained and then lost 30 pounds, and they say, well, I'm not going to go there again. I've never been overweight. A lot of people have never been overweight. But once we start getting into our, late 50s, 60s, early 60s, mid 60s, aging tends to be the number one cause. Despite the obesity epidemic, aging tends to be the number one cause of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance, in turn, is the number one cause of cardiovascular inflammation. The bottom line is you can't feel it. You can't predict it. So you're taking your chances if you go off. I will say this, when I'm seeing patients, I understand I delayed taking my own for about 3 years before I finally bit the bullet. But, after developing plaque, I think it's risky to go off of them. The other thing is, I don't think that you need LDL levels of statins. Lipitor, 40 milligrams, I don't ever use that. I only use a couple of different statins, rosuvastatin and pitavastatin, or Crestor and Livalo. And I use low doses because low doses manages that cardiovascular inflammation. You don't need the high doses that impacts LDL level. Thank you so much, Fort Worth. That was a great opportunity for me to go down that bunny hole. Alejandro Rios, and practice a sport. The best form to do that without suffering. Yes, I used to be a basketball player. Loved it. It's a lot more fun than just running in circles. Fort Worth West Side. I started my HIIT training by chasing 5 puppies around the backyard till I get winded. They love it too. I bet they do. You got to figure out a way. Doing interval training needs to be a part of your routine life. You might as well figure out a way to make it entertaining. Mezzanine, do you think it's possible that long-term endurance event training is pro-inflammatory, particularly to the arterial lining? It very well might be. I've run several marathons and an ultra, and you just keep going, and there's no question that it's inflammatory on the running joints, the knees, the ankles, the feet. But your question is, could it be inflammatory for cardiovascular purposes as well? One of the other things that happens with these long, slow distances is they do decrease the muscle mass of the legs. You look at a distance runner, they've got tiny legs. Remember, those leg muscles are the muscles that are most important to maintaining good glucose control. So in that way too, yes, you have potentially some added risk there. So it's great question, Mezzanine. Thank you. Parker Reed at Bart Robinson, agree. Risk of injury increases the more you do it. It's a good point. Bart, indoor training has been shown to increase arterial plaque, but maybe it's more stable news. Oh, Indu training. I think that's something else. Freedom Fox 1, how many 40-second sets should HIT? Great question. So you're talking about HIT, you're talking about how many sets? Number one, 2 to 3 sets per week. And what's a set? That's the Freedom Fox's question. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Start with 3 minimum. Work up to no more than 20. Usually for us boomers, anywhere between 10 and 15 is a good number. Bart, endurance training has been shown to possibly increase the plaque burden, but maybe make it more stable. Hopefully we can discuss that in a future broadcast. That is, this whole issue of, the endurance training, well, what does it do? Number one, it helps decrease weight and body fat, and weight and body fat are clearly major drivers of plaque and risk. But on the other hand, as we just discussed, it also tends to decrease muscle mass. So very subtle, a lot of balance there. Lucian P. So running marathons is not healthy. I'm not a big marathon fan anymore. I used to do it. I'm much more, and yes, you got to get aerobics. You got to get an aerobic base each week, 4 or 5 times a week. But, again, I was able to keep up a schedule of half marathons by playing basketball and some other stuff. But if you're going to do a marathon, you got to do hours and hours of road work, pounding each week. And if your goal is just cardiovascular fitness, you got to add more stuff in there. You got to mix it up. And again, consider how much endurance, how many hours of pounding the pavement you need to do. Parker Reed, how about Tabatas or Tabatas, depending on how you pronounce it? Tabatas versus HIIT. Well, what is the difference between a Tabata and an HIIT? I used to do Tabatas, and I'm trying to remember the certain specific types. It's counting a certain amount, going real fast, and then going a little bit slower. But Tabatas is, in my mind, yet another version of high-intensity interval work. Also, Parker says, I just read heavyweight training, guilty, of creating arterial stiffness. Are you aware of that? Well, I don't think it's the resistance training, and I don't think it's how much weight you're using. Although I don't really recommend doing a lot of. It's not like we're trying to become world-class bodybuilders. I mean, that's for folks on this channel. At least for myself, that's not the goal. The goal is cardiovascular health. On resistance training, what we do is recommend in the beginning and throughout, go with much lower weights. For example, doing a mini squats or mini lunges with much less weight than you might expect. You know, you talk about resistance training, and especially if you talk about that to men, they start thinking about their guns, their arms. Those are helpful, but you know, your arms, the muscles in your arms are nowhere near the size of the muscles in your legs, so they're not really going to have nearly the impact on prediabetes, cardiovascular inflammation that your larger muscles will have. Number two, again, we're talking more about getting tone and getting repetition. There's a thing called TUT, time under tension. So this old model of getting really heavy weights and doing, 10 squats, and then you're done. Maybe do 3 sets of 12 squats. That's not really the best way to go either. Now, a lot of people would say, no, you don't want to do that. You want to do the absolute amount that you can do in 3 reps. I understand that. I'm familiar with that as well. I don't think that's the best. That's not what I would recommend for cardiovascular fitness and cardiovascular prevention. I recommend starting off, it's like Arnold says, reps, reps, reps. He's sick of doing reps, but that's what he does all day, every day. And you have to start with embarrassingly low weights. Do 40 reps of an embarrassingly low weight, then do 30 more. And then those do 20 more. And maybe in those last 20 or the last 10, at that point, that's the time to really crank up the resistance if you want significant musculature. But if you don't have time under tension, you're not going to get the stimulation that your muscle needs for growth and improvement. Lucian P, 20 sets of HIIT. I can't imagine. Well, it's not 20 sets, it's 20 interval cycles. Yeah. And well, that's hard. I don't do 20. I tend to average 12. I've done different types right now during the COVID shutdown, and we haven't gotten back into our gym yet. I live on a circle. It's about 1 mile, and I can do 2 to 3 intervals on that. So I end up doing about 12 intervals. James Cantor, hi everyone, like the video. Thank you so much, James. I appreciate that. Lucian P, I could only do at most 4. Well, keep working at it. This is something that takes some time and discipline and patience. Lisa Fraker, Lisa Gilliam, love your broadcasts. Is this the Lisa that used to work at Toyota? Either way, thank you very much, Lisa. I appreciate that. S55B, is it important when taking a statin that it's a hydrophilic over a lipophilic statin? You see and hear a lot of that. The reality is, I think for most cases, the hydrophilic versus lipophilic statins are a little bit overblown. Again, you can get into some theory. We can discuss that. I just really try to keep it simple. Low dose rosuvastatin, low dose Livalo, and neither one of them, neither one of them tends to have the side effects and the problems that you see with other statins, especially the high dose. Fort Worth West Side, I'll stay on the Crestor at 5. Do you prescribe low dose aspirin as well? Yes, I don't recommend taking, people. A couple of things about aspirin. Number one, the Esprit trial came out, the Ascend trial, and people started saying, well, you shouldn't take aspirin because it doesn't really help. Here's what actually happened. We have gotten better despite the obesity epidemic, despite the continuing problems. We have actually decreased as a culture heart attack and stroke over the past few years. So your typical comparison group has a little bit less risk. They looked at that in the Esprit trial and the Ascend trial, and they said, you know what? Aspirin's really not worth it anymore. They were given aspirin for age. They were not giving aspirin for having plaque. If somebody has documented plaque, I do recommend baby aspirin. Now, I don't, and some people think, well, if I'm taking a baby aspirin, a big aspirin's going to be better. No, not the case. Taking a big aspirin actually even increases risk. So keep it with the baby aspirin. Well, let me see. Did we cover? I have no plaque, no obvious detriment to my breathing, and no noticeable health from partial blockage of left descending, no stent. Oh, I have plaque, no obvious detriment. Yes, I have plaque too. I've got a calcium score of what, 90 something? And, I thought I was doing the right thing. We can get back into my story sometime later. Mezzanine, in the running scene for decades, including ultras, many top runners seem to age quickly and have a seemingly higher incidence of cancers and other issues. It's a good point, Mezzanine. Thank you for sharing that. Freedom Fox 1, walking after strength training is supposed to mitigate arterial stiffness. I clearly recommend a little bit of aerobics prior to, like walking, prior to working out with the weights to get warmed up, and afterwards to cool down. Now, what happened here? Oh, we skipped over Jonathan Hull, a $10. It's so interesting. Today we've got a lot of folks who've been giving some wonderful donations on Super Chat. I appreciate that. Good morning, Dr. B. Is it common to have high Lp(a) and zero calcium score? Is there any research that shows HIIT reduces Lp(a)? I'm not familiar with research focused on Lp(a) alone, but the connection between exercise and Lp(a) alone. Those of you who are not familiar with Lp(a), it's a genetic variation of LDL. It has what we call, the protein on it looks like there was a genetic repeat set up. The repeats on the protein for Lp(a) are called Kringle repeats. We used to think that maybe these Kringle repeats form a hook, which allows it to hook into the artery wall. I don't really think that's it. I think it has more to do with how that carries oxidized oxidized cholesterol. But in either way, the question is, does exercise help? I will tell you this, it's really clear. Oh, and one other thing, for those of you who, again, not familiar with Lp(a), look up, Google Bob Harper. He was the trainer for The Biggest Loser in his early 50s, in great shape, and he had a heart attack when he was working out. And he announced about a week later, yep, I've got Lp(a). There's also, I've got a lot of patients, given what I do for a living, I've got a lot of patients that have significant Lp(a) risk. We've done several videos on them. Joe covered his studies. Just Google Lp(a) or go to YouTube, search Ford Brewer Lp(a), and you'll see a lot of information on it. Now, here's the thing. For exercise I know helps, because basically with Lp(a), with any of the cardiovascular diseases, there are multiple risk factors. And if you have one risk factor, the goal, the way to manage it is not just work on that one risk factor alone. You want to manage all of the risk factors. So for example, like I said, I've got plenty of people with Lp(a). They tend to not have a problem until something else happens. If they're a smoker, for example, and the smoking does it. But the people with significant Lp(a) problems tend to start having that when they get into their 50s and 60s and start getting insulin resistant. There's a gene pool of French Canadians that have very, very high world-class level Lp(a)s. And as I mentioned Joe Riley a few minutes ago, world-class levels. they still tend to not have problems until they start getting into insulin resistance. So exercise clearly has a major component of dealing with the other risk factors, especially insulin resistance. So from that perspective, it tends to help. Thank you, Jonathan. It's a great question. I hope I didn't dance around that issue and confuse it too much. Alan Turner, does HIIT lower LP(a)? Again, same issue. Let me actually, Jonathan and Alan, approach this a slightly different way. There is a perception, there's not a lot of us that follow LP(a). Those of us who do, there's going to become more and more of us that follow it. It'll probably become a standard of screening now that they're developing meds for it. There's medication. If you're interested in that topic, look up LP(a) antisense medications. And the antisense medications are just kicking the bottom out of LP(a). They're making a big difference. It's going to still be a while before you show impact on risk. Anyway, those of us who've been following LP(a) for a long time notice a couple of things. Number one, old niacin, good old niacin over the counter, gets beat up a lot. It's not innocuous. It's not totally harmless. Neither is breathing and neither is water. But niacin tends to decrease LP(a). The other thing I was going to say is that managing all risk factors tends to decrease cardiovascular inflammation, and decreased cardiovascular inflammation tends to lead to lower LP(a) values. So you tend to not see people, they're managing everything else and their LP(a) starts to spike more than usual. Usually the LP(a) tends to go up and down with the other inflammatory risk factors that person has. So from that perspective, again, manage all your risk factors, including exercise. Dan Romance, oh, great. Good to see you, Dan. Glad you joined us. Great point. Tut, thanks, Ford. Thank you, Dan. Dan actually gave us a video one time, gave us some information on a lot of related stuff here. Good to see you. Condo Guy 710, how low Livalo? Livalo tends to come in two doses, 2 and 4 milligrams. I usually use the 2. Livalo in and of itself is a low dose statin. It's a kinder, gentler statin. I was able to get 1 milligram Livalo for a while for some patients, but you don't tend to be able to access that. So because of that, I will usually go ahead and go with the 2. Lucian P., what is your opinion of LISS, low intensity steady state instead of HITT, such as going for a 5, 10, or 10 mile walk on the treadmill? So I mentioned it a couple of times, Lucian, you do need to have an aerobic base. And if you look at the data, for example, the evidence on walking, frequent walking, it is a big deal. Now, do you have to go for, well, I would also, myself, for example, I will tend to get usually 5 to 10 miles a day. When I'm hitting over 5 is usually walking. And for example, I spend a lot of time on the phone on meetings. Whenever I can, I will walk while I am doing that. So walking is very, very important. Now, once you start getting up to the 10-mile walks, again, it's a balance. You got to get HIIT in there. You got to get resistance training in there. Unless you're retired and you're spending 20 hours a week on certain types of exercise, you have to figure out, okay, what's going to be most efficient. S55B, thanks. Great video. Thank you so much, S55. I appreciate it. Lucian B, Jonathan, I have high LP(a) and HIIT doesn't seem to have any impact. No, I will tell you this. If you look for a 1-to-1 ratio, I go out and I do significant and different types of exercises and I think I'm going to get a decrease in my LP little a. That's usually not a reliable thing. Lucian P, calcium score of 90. That's really good for your age. It is. It is. I'm full-blown diabetic. Technically, I've only had a glucose score as high as 200 once. It was when my daughter graduated. We were in New Orleans. She was at Tulane, and we went out for. I had too much of a carb vacation that day, and I was wearing a Freestyle Libre. And you could say, well, Freestyle Libre is not very good. I get that. I understand all that. The bottom line is you have any kind of blood sugar at any time, whether you're in a glucose challenge or insulin survey or anything like that, and you get over 200, you meet one of the criteria, one of the core criteria for full-blown diabetes. Now, despite that, I've had the ophthalmologist. I've got a video where we looked at the back of my eyeballs, and I've got one drusen. That's the plural is drusen, and that's what you get with diabetes. So the point being, I have significant insulin resistance to the level of approaching diabetes. Yet I'm able to manage my cardiovascular risk. Swan Moon, Doc, what are the damages of having coffee and creamer for the first few hours in the morning and no meal until later? That's I don't think anybody knows that. I think a lot of people would say, well, and I would say this too, it depends on what's in the creamer. If you're getting a lot of sugar in there, you're getting a hit of insulin and a hit of glucose. If it's just coffee, for example, black coffee, I think that's actually healthy, not unhealthy. Now, again, the question's what's in that creamer? Radiant Truth, I take amlodipine and a beta blocker. Should I still take aspirin at night? Yes, Radiant Truth. For example, I have a blood pressure problem too. I've got a BMI about 22, 23. Still have blood pressure problems, still have the insulin resistance that I mentioned. Take a baby aspirin. I'm taking amlodipine and benazepril, an ACE inhibitor. And I do take a statin. I've been back and forth between low-dose Livalo and low-dose Crestor, depending on my insurance situation. And that's a long story, which I won't get into. Condo Guy, 17, in physical therapy for a year after stopping 2.5 milligrams of rosuvastatin. My calves were bad and leg muscles too. I'm sorry to hear that. You look at the studies, and the studies would indicate that the muscle problems with statins aren't nearly as bad as people think. But the worst thing that a doctor can do is assume when a patient's having challenges with a statin and muscles is to assume that it's in their head. You're a great example, Condo Guy. You clearly can get into some challenges with it. That's why they're prescription drugs. John Tocho, remember to consider Patreon. Thank you so much, John. And Gilbert, if you could just show the Patreon thing. There you go. Great. Gilbert, you're on the ball. I appreciate that. So, John, thank you so much for reminding us. There are several different ways you can help support the channel, help support getting this information out to folks so we can have healthy lives. Patreon, we have a Patreon account. You can do it through PayPal. I think you just use that QR code. And as you've seen several times today, several people have made some Super Chat donations. Thank you again. I see Felix here, and gosh, we've got quite a few other comments. I'm going to try to zip through the rest of them as we get closer to our next meeting. Haywood Hall, 3,000 aspirin deaths per year in the U.S. Thank you, Haywood, for sharing that. Don't know what else to comment about that. Jeff Earnshaw, my LDL has increased since I started a keto diet, but I've lost 50 pounds. Should I stop keto? You bring up a really good point. It depends on how high your LDL has gone, Jeff. There's a thing called lean mass hyperresponders. A lot of people, when they go on a low carb diet, get a significant increase on their LDL. There's a fellow, I don't know why I keep forgetting that guy's name. He's got a whole website about lean mass hyperresponders. Harvard is some of the Harvard newsletters have been about lean mass hyperresponders. They didn't really call them that, but again, it's going on keto and LDL going up. And the assumption is, you could argue this point, but I think it's true. The LDL from that lean mass hyperresponder activity does not appear to be a risk. The one place where I disagree with I think it's the cholesterol connection or something. Somebody help me out. Remind me of that fellow's name. The only place where I disagree with him is this part about, he'll say that, and you'll hear other people say it as well, that lean mass hyperresponders are not FH patients, or they'll say lean mass hyperresponders not the same thing as FH. That is true. Lean mass hyperresponse is not the same as familial hypercholesterolemia. You get really high cholesterol levels in both categories. But here's the thing. There are about 2,000 different genetic variations that lead to familial hypercholesterolemia, and there's clearly, I've got patients where they have FH, we know that, and they go on on a low fat or a keto diet, and their LDL starts cranking back up. So there is some overlap. Again, high LDL from keto diet, I would not worry about the risk associated with that. Mezzanine, I often combine resistance training with HIIT, high intensity intervals, during the same workout. Is it wrong to combine the two in one session? You'll get people that tell you it is. I don't think it is, especially, unless you're doing world-class levels of both. And I mentioned Felix is here. Great information today. Thank you so much, Felix. Great to hear from you. Felix shared his story a couple of times with the group as well. Great story. Full-blown diabetes, started doing the work. Very consistent, hanging in there, lost 30 pounds, actually got improvement on kidney function. And he shared that with the groups. And that's so important, because if you go to most docs will say, no, you cannot improve. Once you get kidney damage, that's permanent. No, you can reverse it. Just try to reverse it before you get to the kidney damage, though. And that's the key. Thank you so much, Felix, for joining us, and thank you for your share. Condo Guy 710, thanks, thumbs up. Lucian, I had a blood sugar over 200, but it doesn't stay there for long. Doesn't have to stay there for long, Lucian. You've met the criteria for type 2 diabetes. Be afraid. Be very afraid. Let that be motivation to deal with these risk factors that we're talking about. Bart, sorry, doc, I said endurance training increases be possibly. Sorry, Bart, I'm still increases probably cardiovascular resistance. And again, we need to dig deeper into just what level, because I don't mind steering people off of doing full-blown marathons and ultra marathons, but we need a little bit of endurance. Sorry, doc, autocorrect is screwing up. Yeah, I can tell. My autocorrect does that too. It's like my internal autocorrect. David Cottrell, have you tried increasing your nitric oxide? Actually, there are several different ways of increasing nitric oxide. One of them is a supplement, beet derivatives, beetroot. Another is making sure that you don't use an alcohol-based gargle. But the most important way is appropriate exercise. Some of this low intensity repetitive exercise tends to improve nitric oxide. Lucian P, I use L-arginine. A lot of people use L-arginine and citrulline for nitric oxide as well. How about super beets? L-citrulline, yep. Beetroot. Parker Reed, probably been asked before, sorry, but thoughts on MCT oil. MCT oil, that's medium chain, is it medium chain triglyceride? It's coconut oil. And I use it. I use it every day. It's a form of fat that comes from coconut, and it's a saturated oil, so saturated fat. So those of you who say saturated fat is bad, you need to study up. Read, if you would rather read more of a reporting type of book. Nina Teicholz has covered that. It's the big fat surprise, great big fat surprise. If you want to do it in more of an academic, or if you like my videos, I've done several videos on big fat surprise with Nina Teicholz, with the JACC article, Journal of the American College of Cardiology, probably as a result of some of the attention that Teicholz's book put on the saturated fat myth. Yes, I said it, the saturated fat myth. They did a review of those studies, a meta-analysis. Saturated fat does not appear to cause cardiovascular risk. Tired looking for name. Dave Feldman. Thank you so much. Tired of looking for name. I knew somebody would remember that. Dave Feldman is the guy that has the great website on lean mass hyperresponder. Kevin Bricker. I know ACEs are superior to ARBs, but is there a third option? I'm having issues with a swollen, elongated uvula, so cardiologist is hesitant to restart me on either. Seen ENT and allergist, no answers. When somebody can't take an ACE or an ARB, I tend to prefer a calcium channel blocker like amlodipine. We used to go with a diuretic, and diuretics like third line these days. It's not as effective at first line. So I would, if you can't do ACE inhibitors, do an amlodipine. Heck Lance, hi. Heck Lance from East Coast of Canada. 4 blocked arteries, decided no. I guess you're saying no operation. I'll be watching your programs with great interest. I've got a lot of Canadian patients. My brother's Canadian now, and he and I've talked some about this issue. And thank you so much for joining us, Heck. I appreciate that. Mezzanine, thanks for all you do. Thank you, Mezzanine. I appreciate it. Parker Reed, low carb, high LDL, keto. Dr. Peter Attila. That's not, is that how you spell that? Peter. Now I'm another senior moment. Peter, he started off as a surgery resident at Hopkins. He's got a lot of TED Talk stuff, and he's in this space as well. Anyhow, he's found changing SFAs to MUFAs drops LDL response. Makes sense. SFAs are inflammatory. You must be talking about saturated fats. If you think saturated fats are inflammatory, again, I would challenge you to read some, look at my more recent videos on the topic. Take a look at some of the evidence that's coming out now. And yes, monounsaturated fats. I think nobody would argue over those. That's things like olive oil, and I don't think anybody olive oil, maybe avocado oil as well. And I think nobody's arguing that those are not safe. So thank you anyway for your interest. Thanks to the rest of you for joining today. And I appreciate what what you've done in terms of your contributions to the channel, your interest. If you do a thumbs up, if you put this content, you refer to it on your social media, especially when the AI, the artificial intelligence from YouTube, recognizes somebody coming in looking for a specific video from Facebook or LinkedIn or one of the other social media, it really does have a big impact on how much they get this information out there. Atia, Pilgrim Lady, thank you so much. I knew that didn't look right. Peter Atia. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you guys next week.